Did I hurt you that night of this incident?
Yes.
I did. And how did I hurt you?
It's me.
Some cases are terrifying because of what happened inside the home. This one is terrifying because of what happened inside the courtroom afterwards. On March 18th, 2018, in Riverview, Florida, 911 operators received a call that sounded like pure panic. A woman was screaming for help. The line was chaotic. It was the kind of call that makes dispatchers sit up straight because you can hear the danger in real time. That caller was Kenyatta Barron. But what makes this case even more chilling is what happened next. Minutes later, there was a second 911 call. This time, it was Ronnie O'Neill III calling, and according to court summaries, he told dispatch that he had been attacked and that he killed her. 2 calls, back to back, one begging for help, one declaring what happened. By the time deputies rushed to the address, the scene was already beyond anything domestic dispute is supposed to mean. A neighbor named James Gray would later become one of the key witnesses because he saw and heard parts of what was happening outside. In later accounts, he described seeing Barron down and O'Neill over her, yelling Allahu Akbar and shouting, "You don't understand." It didn't sound like an argument anymore. It sounded like someone completely detached from reality. Deputies entered the home and found a scene of extreme violence and chaos. Kenyatta Barron was dead. The way her death was described in court records centered on blunt force trauma, with a gunshot wound also referenced in the case summary. And then the worst part, there were children in that home. Not 2 surviving kids, like some early rumors made people assume. This case is the opposite, and it's even more heartbreaking. Ronnie and Kenyatta had 2 children in the house, an 8-year-old son and a 9-year-old daughter named Ronivia. Ronivia did not survive. The son did. And that survivor detail becomes the spine of the entire case. Because according to later reporting, the boy survived long enough to stagger out after deputies arrived. Not long enough to be fine, long enough to be alive. Prosecutors also described another horrifying element. The daughter was killed with a hatchet. That single detail tells you why this case made national headlines, even without the media leaning into gore. It's the sheer brutality of using something like that inside a family home against a child. And as if the violence itself wasn't enough, the home also caught fire during or after the attacks. It became a formal charge, first-degree arson. From the beginning, O'Neill tried to frame what happened as self-defense. A major pretrial push by the defense was to use Florida's Stand Your Ground law, arguing that Barron tried to kill him and that he acted in self-defense. This wasn't some casual legal argument. It was a high-stakes attempt to avoid a murder trial altogether. The court denied it. The case moved forward as a prosecution for murder, and prosecutors were not playing small. The state sought the death penalty. This was capital level, the highest stakes. And then O'Neill did something that stunned even seasoned observers. He chose to represent himself. No attorney as the public face. No buffer. No filter. He went pro se, and that decision set up one of the most shocking courtroom moments in modern true crime coverage. Because the surviving child wasn't just a witness. He was O'Neill's own son. By the time of trial in 2021, that boy took the stand at around age 11, and he testified about what he saw and heard inside that home, testimony that became central to the prosecution's case. Then came the moment people still talk about, Ronnie O'Neill III cross-examining his own son. It is hard to describe how psychologically disturbing that is without even mentioning a single graphic detail, because it's not just testimony, it's a power struggle, a father trying to intimidate the one witness he can't silence. But by all accounts, the boy held his ground. They heard neighbor testimony, they heard law enforcement testimony, they heard forensic testimony, and they saw the pattern prosecutors were building. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a split-second accident. This was a deliberate, escalating explosion of violence, followed by arson. In June 2021, the jury found Ronnie O'Neill III guilty, not just on the murders and the attempted murder, but on the additional counts tied to what happened to the child's survivor and his behavior during arrest. The affirmed conviction list includes first-degree arson, 2 counts of aggravated child abuse, and resisting an officer without violence, on top of the core violent felonies. The sentencing that followed was a sledgehammer. 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 90 years. Consecutive. That number matters because it's the system saying even life isn't enough to capture the full scope of what you did. At sentencing, the presiding judge, Michelle Cisco, described it as among the worst cases she had seen. That's not casual language. When the judge says a case is among the worst, it means it crossed a line even for them. After conviction, O'Neill appealed, and on August 18, 2023, Florida's 2nd District Court of Appeal affirmed the judgment and sentences. The verdict stood. The sentence stood. No parole, no path back to society. But the emotional center of this case isn't him. It's what the surviving son had to become. In one night, he lost his mother. He lost his sister. His home was turned into a disaster scene. And then he had to do the unthinkable. Sit in court, point to his own father, and tell the truth. And then endure being questioned by him. 2 weeks after a divorce hearing, a home in Indiana became a crime scene. Not after months, not years, 14 days. Michael Kegg Jr. had recently been in court with his ex-wife, Melissa Kegg, 51 years old. The marriage was unraveling publicly. Tensions were high, finances were strained, and according to reporting presented in court, control was slipping. Then came the night. Everything exploded. Inside the home were Melissa and her 34-year-old son, Michael Kegg III, an adult son, a separate life, a different generation. He was not a rival, not part of the divorce battle. He was simply there. What happened next was not an accident and not self-defense. It was a deliberate double killing. Authorities determined a shotgun was used. Investigators recovered a shotgun and shells at the scene. The violence was followed by something even more telling, an attempt to erase it. Flammable liquid was poured on the bodies, and the house was set on fire in an effort to conceal the killings. First responders arrived to fight what appeared to be a house fire. Instead, they uncovered a double homicide scene, and the timeline began to tighten. In court, prosecutors argued the motive went beyond simple divorce anger. They pointed to financial stress, resentment, and a pattern of escalating hostility. Reporting also revealed that the day before the killings, Michael Kegg Jr. allegedly attempted to terminate Melissa's utility services. It wasn't violence yet, but it was pressure, a form of control. The state's theory was simple. The divorce hearing 2 weeks earlier was gasoline. Financial strain was the match. But there was another layer that stunned many following the case. Phone behavior. According to reporting presented in court, Michael Kegg Jr. allegedly left his phone behind before the killings. His then wife, Amanda Kegg, initially told investigators she had not seen him that day. Later, her statements reportedly changed. She allegedly told investigators that he instructed her to leave her phone at home and drive him to Francisco, Indiana, because he needed to take care of something. She also allegedly left her own phone behind. Leaving phones behind is a known method to avoid location tracking. Prosecutors used that to argue planning. During that same window of time, Amanda reportedly withdrew $800, the maximum daily limit, from a bank account while she said she was waiting. And then there was Michael Kegg Jr.'s own statement to investigators. He reportedly claimed he went to the victim's home to work on a vehicle. He said he was told he needed to leave. He claimed he walked away and later noticed sirens responding to the scene. That explanation didn't hold up. Forensic analysis, fire investigation findings, and ballistic evidence pointed in a different direction. Authorities determined the fire was intentionally set after the shotgun killings. The jury listened. In January 2026, Michael Kegg Jr. was convicted of 2 counts of murder. The courtroom didn't see a grieving ex-husband. They saw planning. They saw escalation. They saw an attempt to burn away responsibility. Then came sentencing on February 13th, 2026. 64 years for the killing of his son, Michael Kegg III. 62 years for the killing of Melissa Kegg. Consecutive, 126 years total. The judge's decision reflected something prosecutors emphasized heavily: betrayal of trust, especially toward his own son. Because this wasn't a stranger, this wasn't a bar fight. This was a father and his adult child, inside a home that should have been safe. And there was another shock to the case that pushed it beyond a simple domestic tragedy. Amanda Kegg, his wife at the time, was charged in connection with the case. She has been charged with murder and conspiracy counts and has pleaded not guilty. Her case is pending, with trial proceedings reported as scheduled later in 2026. Prosecutors argued that leaving phones behind and the transportation details were not coincidence. They suggested cooperation. The defense, however, pushed back, and her case remains separate. But for Michael Kegg Jr., the jury decision was final. The sentence of 126 years ensures he will spend the rest of his life inside the Indiana Department of Correction. This rampage didn't begin with a family argument. It began with a carjacking in Trenton, New Jersey. On March 16, 2024, Andre Gordon Jr. stole a vehicle in Trenton. At that point, no one knew they were watching the first move of something much bigger. Carjackings happen. They make local news. They don't usually shut down 2 states. But this one was different, because instead of disappearing into traffic, Gordon drove with purpose. He crossed the Delaware River into Bucks County, Pennsylvania, heading straight into the Levittown section of Falls Township. He wasn't hunting strangers. He was going home. At the first residence, authorities say he shot and killed his stepmother, Karen Murphy Gordon, 52 years old, and his 13-year-old sister, Kara Gordon, 13. That's the detail that hits like a punch to the chest. A teenage girl inside her own home. No warning, no time to run. Police would later confirm that multiple people were inside the house when the attack happened. Some survived by sheer luck or by hiding, but Gordon wasn't finished. He left that home and drove to a second residence in Levittown. This one belonged to Taylor Daniel, 25 years old, the mother of his 2 young daughters. Inside that house, he killed her. During that same attack, Taylor's mother, the children's grandmother, was struck with a rifle and seriously injured, but she survived. And the most haunting detail of all, the children were nearby. Prosecutors later revealed they hid while their mother was being killed. That's what makes this case unforgettable. Within a short span of time, 3 members of his own family were dead. A stepmother, a 13-year-old sister, and the mother of his children. And the man responsible wasn't some outsider breaking in through a window. He already knew the layout. He already knew the addresses. As the killings were reported, panic spread across Bucks County. Authorities issued shelter-in-place orders. Businesses shut down. Public events were cancelled. Residents were told to lock their doors and stay inside, because the suspect was still moving. After the Pennsylvania killings, Gordon carjacked another vehicle in Morrisville, Pennsylvania. That second carjacking extended the chaos. It meant he was mobile again. It meant the threat wasn't contained. Police from multiple agencies coordinated across state lines. Bridges were monitored. Streets were blocked. Tactical teams were deployed. And then came one of the most surreal moments of the entire day. Authorities believed Gordon had barricaded himself inside a house in Trenton. Officers surrounded the property. Hours passed with a tense standoff atmosphere. News cameras rolled. Neighbors waited. But he wasn't inside. Investigators later determined he had slipped away before the police perimeter fully closed in. While police were focused on one house, he was already gone. The manhunt ended not with a shootout, not with a dramatic final stand, but with officers spotting him walking a few blocks away in Trenton. He was taken into custody, unarmed, just like that. After 3 killings, 2 carjackings, an injured grandmother, terrified children, and a regional lockdown, he was walking down the street. Authorities later confirmed the weapon involved was described in court documents as a ghost gun, an untraceable firearm assembled from parts. That detail adds another layer to the planning element of the case. When prosecutors addressed the public, they were asked the obvious question, why? And their answer was unsettling. They said the motive was unclear. No definitive financial dispute explanation. No confirmed custody ruling. No clean headline motive that ties everything together. Just violence directed inward at family. Initially, the Bucks County District Attorney announced they would seek the death penalty. That tells you how seriously the case was viewed. 3 first-degree murders, a teenage victim, children present, an interstate manhunt. But after consulting with the victims' families, prosecutors changed course. On May 28, 2025, Andre Gordon Jr. pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. There was no full trial, no months of dramatic testimony. He entered a guilty plea, and sentencing followed. The judge imposed 3 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. But that wasn't all. For the additional crimes tied to that day, including burglary, robbery, and carjacking, the court added another 156.5 to 313 years on top. 3 lifetimes, plus over a century more. And even after his arrest, violence followed him. While in custody, he was sentenced in connection with assaults on corrections officers. It didn't end when the sirens stopped. 3 life sentences without parole, and the motive that still isn't clearly defined. That's what makes this case linger.
I'm sorry, I don't remember doing it. You remember more than that. No.
Suburban Arizona, engineer at Motorola, devoted church member, married nearly 20 years to Yarmila Faleta. 2 children, no violent criminal history, no public implosions, the kind of neighbor you'd trust with a spare key. On a late night in January 1997, that image shattered. Around 10 p.m., a neighbor heard something unusual coming from the Faleta backyard. Moaning, crying, distress. She looked outside and saw movement near the pool area. She watched as a man appeared to struggle with a woman near the water. She called 911. When officers arrived, they found Yarmila Faleta in the backyard pool. She had been stabbed 44 times. Police entered the home and found Scott Faleta inside, upstairs, moving around. Officers later described confronting him as he came down the stairs. He was taken into custody there, inside his own house. What investigators uncovered next made the case even more disturbing. A hunting knife was located in a plastic container in the trunk of his car. Bloody clothing had also been placed inside that container. There were signs he had changed clothes. In other words, a concealment. That detail would become the prosecution's anchor, because Scott Faleta didn't deny that he was responsible. He said he was asleep. His defense was parasomnia, a sleep disorder involving abnormal behavior during sleep. According to his legal team, he had a history of sleepwalking. They argued he was in a dissociative state that night, that he had no awareness of what he was doing, that he did not plan it, that he did not remember it. I don't remember, I didn't plan it. But the state saw something else. Maricopa County prosecutors sought the death penalty. They argued this wasn't a confused episode. This was intentional murder. One detective later recounted interrogating Faleta and challenging his version of events. During questioning, officers pointed out blood on his neck. The image of a calm man being told he had blood on him stuck with many observers. At trial, medical experts testified about parasomnia. They explained that in rare circumstances, individuals can perform complex behaviors while technically asleep. Walking, driving, even cooking. The defense leaned into that science hard. They suggested the stabbing could have occurred during a sleepwalking episode. They argued that Faleta returned to bed afterward without awareness. But prosecutors pressed the jury with a brutal counterpoint. Sleepwalkers don't typically drag a body. Sleepwalkers don't typically hold someone underwater. Sleepwalkers don't usually change clothes, place a knife and bloody garments into a plastic container, and put it in the trunk of their car. That sequence is what shattered the defense for many jurors. Even some jurors later said in interviews that they could entertain the possibility of stabbing during a dissociative episode, but not the extended actions afterward. That was the turning point. There was no single explosive motive established at trial. Prosecutors referenced marital strain, tension over church activities, and financial disagreements. But this wasn't a case with a neat trigger like insurance money or a public affair. The absence of a clear motive actually made the sleepwalking defense more dramatic. If there was no obvious reason to kill her, maybe he really was unconscious. That's the psychological hook that still fuels debates about this case. But the physical evidence weighed heavily. A neighbor saw the struggle. Jamila suffered 44 stab wounds. Her head was forced underwater. The weapon and bloody clothes were stored in a container in the car. Those actions suggested awareness. In 1999, the jury rejected the sleepwalking defense. In January 2000, Scott Folleter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The death penalty had been on the table. Instead, the court ensured he would never walk free. Federal habeas proceedings followed, but the conviction stood. He remains incarcerated in Arizona. This case has become a staple in law schools and forensic psychology discussions. It's often cited when debating the limits of the automatism defense. How much complexity is too much for unconscious behavior? Where is the line between disorder and decision? But strip away the academic debates, and what's left is this. 2 children lost their mother. A suburban backyard became a crime scene. And a man who looked perfectly ordinary claimed he had been dreaming. If you ever want to understand what no one was safe really means, listen to the timeline of this case. On the night of October 17, 2023, in New Orleans, a mother called 911 at around 11:55 p.m. She told the dispatcher the father of her children, Joseph Washington Sr., was threatening to burn down their home. Not, "I'm worried he might." Not, "He's acting strange." A direct threat. Burn the house down. And then the worst part, it wasn't a future danger. It was immediate. Moments after that call, a fire was reported at the home on America Street. Firefighters arrived just after midnight. Police arrived minutes later. By the time the first responders got there, the house was already engulfed. Inside were 3 children, an 8-year-old boy, a 5-year-old girl, and a 3-year-old child. Firefighters managed to pull the 8-year-old and 5-year-old out, racing them to the hospital. About an hour later, both were pronounced dead. The 3-year-old was found deceased inside the home. That's the gut punch of this case. Even when first responders did everything they could, the fire moved faster than rescue. And the mother wasn't home when it happened. She wasn't inside with them, which means she had to live with a reality that is impossible to describe. She made the call. She warned them. And still, the house burned with her kids inside. Investigators quickly framed it as the result of an apparent domestic dispute. Police identified Joseph Washington Sr. as the prime suspect and put out a bolo for his vehicle. And this part is important because the story didn't end at the crime scene. It turned into a manhunt. In the hours that followed, authorities found his vehicle partially submerged in the Mississippi River in Gretna. He wasn't in it. So now it wasn't just a suspect. It was a suspect who may be trying to vanish. Later, investigators received intelligence that he was in another vehicle. Law enforcement moved in, and when they finally located him, it wasn't a calm surrender. He was apprehended on Interstate 610 eastbound at the Elysian Fields exit. Then came a moment that tells you exactly how desperate he was to avoid capture. When the vehicle stopped, he tried to flee by jumping off the overpass. That image alone is cinematic in the darkest way. A father accused of burning his own children to death, then trying to launch himself off an interstate ramp to escape the consequences. He was taken to a hospital for treatment. Then he was booked. At the time of his arrest, authorities charged him with 3 counts of second-degree murder, 3 counts of second-degree cruelty to a juvenile, and 1 count of aggravated arson. But the public didn't need legal terminology to understand what this meant. A 911 call warning of a fire, a house burning moments later, 3 children dead, a manhunt, a suspect trying to flee. The story was already seared into the city. And then, months later, the Courtroom chapter added another layer that made this case explode online. On April 11, 2024, Joseph Washington pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of obstruction of justice. That plea matters, because first-degree murder in Louisiana brings a mandatory sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The plea wasn't a maybe, it was the legal end of doubt. And prosecutors made it clear this wasn't just about getting a conviction. It was also about sparing the family a drawn-out trial with brutal details and years of appeals. Here's the part people argue about in the comments. Why not seek the death penalty? The answer is cold but real. In many cases, families don't want to spend a decade reliving the worst night of their lives while appeals drag on. That's what the guilty plea delivered. guaranteed life without parole. But even that wasn't enough to contain the emotion in the room, because right after the plea, the courtroom erupted. A female relative rushed Washington and struck him. People surged forward. Deputies piled in to separate them. It was chaos. And this is where the case takes another disturbing turn, because there wasn't only one defendant thread. Prosecutors also pursued his girlfriend, Shanika Phillips, accusing her of helping Washington after the crime, aiding him as he tried to evade law enforcement in the aftermath. After the fire, there were alleged actions taken to help him escape the net that was closing, and later, even that court process turned violent. At 11:55 p.m., there's a warning call. He's threatening to burn down the home. Moments later, the fire is reported. Firefighters arrive at 12:14 a.m. Police arrive at 12:20 a.m. This isn't a vague sometime that night story. It's a minute-by-minute nightmare. And the most devastating detail is that 2 of the children were actually rescued, pulled out alive, and still didn't make it. A court-ordered custody visit is supposed to be boring. A pickup, a weekend, maybe some awkward small talk, maybe tension, but nothing more. In November 2012, 13-year-old Dylan Redwine boarded a flight to Colorado to spend Thanksgiving break with his father Mark Redwine in the small mountain community of Vallecito near Durango. Dylan didn't go because he wanted to. He went because the custody arrangement required it. And that detail is what makes this case so terrifying for parents watching at home. The legal system can put a child in a situation where the danger isn't outside the home, it's inside it. Dylan arrived on November 18th, 2012. By the next day, November 19th, he was gone. Exactly when he was last seen depends on which official summary you read. And that matters, because the entire case hinges on a narrow window of time. Mark Redwine's account to investigators was that Dylan was there when he left, and gone when he returned. But no matter which version you use, the unchanging fact is this: Dylan vanished while under his father's care. Mark reported him missing and suggested possibilities that sounded plausible on the surface. Maybe Dylan ran away. Maybe he left after an argument. Maybe he wandered off. But Dylan's mother, Elaine Howell, didn't buy it for a second. She said her son would not just disappear without contacting someone. Friends and family echoed that. Dylan had people he trusted, and he had ways to reach them. He didn't simply evaporate. Search teams flooded the area. Volunteers combed the rugged terrain around Vallecito Lake. Deputies ran door to door. Helicopters circled. The landscape out there is beautiful, but it's also brutal. Thick wilderness, steep drops, endless places for a body to never be found. Days passed, then weeks, then months. And the longer Dylan was missing, the more the hope phase died and the dread phase took over. In June 2013, hikers found partial human remains in a remote area near Vallecito. They were later identified as Dylan Redwine, and if you think that was the end, it wasn't. In November 2013, investigators found Dylan's skull in a separate location. That discovery turned the case from missing child into something unmistakably darker. Dylan didn't just vanish, he was dead, and his remains were scattered across terrain that didn't make sense for a simple accident. More remains were found later in the years that followed, adding to the picture prosecutors would eventually bring into court. This was a homicide, and there was only one person Dylan was last known to be with, Mark Redwine. For years, Mark stayed in the public eye, doing interviews and suggesting explanations that sounded like deflection. He floated theories about Dylan running away. He talked about wildlife. He hinted at outside threats. And the longer time went on, the more the public split into 2 camps. The people who desperately wanted to believe a father couldn't do this, and the people who felt the answers were hiding in plain sight. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were building something slow and methodical. Then came a massive turning point. July 2017, a grand jury indicted Mark Redwine, and he was arrested. 5 years after Dylan disappeared, the case finally moved from suspicion to formal accusation. And when prosecutors laid out their theory, it included a motive that was so shocking it became the viral hook of the entire story. They argued Dylan discovered compromising, humiliating photos of his father. Not just embarrassing, the kind of images that a 13-year-old should never have to see, Prosecutors argued Dylan discovered photos on his father's computer involving human feces and diapers. The state's theory was that Dylan confronted Mark about what he found, and Mark panicked. Mark feared exposure. Mark feared humiliation. Mark feared losing control in the custody battle and losing his standing in the community. And prosecutors said that fear turned into violence. The motive wasn't money. It wasn't a random predator. It was humiliation. A father's secret discovered by his own son. That motive thread was heavily litigated in court, including testimony from Dylan's older brother, Corey, who became a key figure in explaining how Dylan learned about the photos and what Dylan may have said. The defense attacked that angle aggressively. They argued Dylan had confronted Mark about the photos before, including through messages, without being harmed, trying to show that the photos alone didn't explain murder. They pushed the idea that the state was building an entire motive on something sensational, not solid. But prosecutors didn't rely on motive alone. They brought in what they had: forensics, timelines, and controversial evidence that would become one of the most debated parts of the entire case. Cadaver dogs. Dog handlers testified that trained dogs alerted to the odor of human remains connected to Mark's property, including areas in the home, the truck, and specific items. That kind of evidence always sparks debate because it's not like DNA, it's not like video footage. It relies on training and interpretation. But in this case, it mattered because the dogs weren't alerting in random places in the wilderness. They were alerting around Mark Redwine's world. And when the prosecution stacked that with the reality that Dylan was last known to be with his father, the picture sharpened. The road to trial was long, and the case had its own what is happening courtroom twist before the conviction even happened. In 2020, the first trial attempt ended in a mistrial connected to COVID concerns involving the defense team. The case didn't collapse, it stalled. And in true crime, stalled cases are where public interest either dies or doubles. This one doubled, because now the public had waited almost 8 years for answers, then watched the first attempt fall apart, and they wanted the final chapter. That final chapter arrived in 2021, with a special prosecutor brought in to try the case. Jurors heard the prosecution's motive theory in full. Dylan confronted Mark about the photos. Mark snapped, and Dylan never left that house alive. They heard about the remains found in June 2013, the skull found in November 2013, and the later discoveries that built a timeline of concealment. And they heard the defense argue the obvious: no eyewitness, no confession, no clean murder weapon, publicly pinned down in the way audiences expect from TV crime shows. But real cases don't always come with a smoking gun. Sometimes they come with a simple reality. The last person with the child is the person the child never returned from. In July 2021, the jury convicted Mark Redwine of second-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. At sentencing, Judge Jeffrey Wilson imposed the maximum, 48 years in prison. 48 years is a strange number to hear in a case that feels like it should be life. But it still means this: Mark Redwine will spend most, if not all, of the rest of his life behind bars. And for viewers, this case hits a nerve that goes beyond the crime itself. Because Dylan didn't disappear while hitchhiking. He didn't vanish at a party. He didn't get lost on some reckless adventure. He went on a custody visit. A judge ordered it. A father was supposed to be safe. And prosecutors argued that the very thing Dylan discovered, the father's secret, became the reason Dylan never came home. Some stories are disturbing because they're violent. This one is disturbing because it's like watching a chain of forbidding choices snap tighter until it finally breaks everything in reach. Steven Pladl's story starts years before the headlines, with adoption. He had a biological daughter, Katie, who was placed for adoption as an infant. She grew up in another family, in another life, with no normal father-daughter bond to anchor what family was supposed to mean. Then, as an adult, Katie found Steven again. Social media made it easy. A message, a reply, a reunion that, on paper, should have been cautious, emotional, and boundary-heavy. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. What followed wasn't a normal reconnection. Steven didn't re-enter her life as a father trying to make amends. Very quickly, their relationship crossed the most unthinkable line. They began living together as a couple. They presented themselves as partners. They told people they were in love. And then it escalated again. Katie became pregnant. A baby boy was born. His name was Bennett. 7 months old. That number matters because it kills the illusion that this was some distant scandal that never touched real life. There was a real infant in the middle of it. A child who had no choice in any of this. And the way Steven's wife found out makes it even more disturbing. In May 2017, she read her 11-year-old daughter's journal, and that's where it was spelled out. The child had written about Steven and Katie as if it was a real relationship, and even noted that Katie was pregnant. That's when the secret stopped being rumor and became undeniable inside the home. Authorities got involved, and the case turned criminal. A key detail that gets mixed up in a lot of retellings is jurisdiction. Reports tied the incest charges to Virginia, including warrants out of Henrico County. Even though the pair were physically in North Carolina, the legal gravity pulled from Virginia. In early 2018, Steven and Katie were arrested in Knightdale, North Carolina, on those warrants. Katie was held as the extradition process played out. And once they were out, there were bond conditions meant to stop the situation from escalating further, including that they were not supposed to communicate with each other. That wasn't a suggestion. It was a boundary imposed by the system because even the system could see the volatility. But bond conditions only work if the people involved respect them. And in this case, everything was already unstable. Because beneath the scandal, there was a relationship dynamic that was spiraling fast. Reports tied the final rupture to a breakup, Katie ending the relationship. If that sounds like a normal relationship detail, it isn't. When the relationship itself is the violation, a breakup doesn't restore normalcy. It can trigger obsession, rage, and the kind of, if I can't have it, no one can. Then came the call that flipped everything into emergency mode. Steven Pladl's mother called 911, and what she told the dispatcher wasn't vague. It wasn't, I'm worried. She reported that Steven had told her he killed the baby. And then, even more chilling, she reported that he later said he had killed Katie and her adoptive father. That 911 call is the spine of this entire case, because it did two things at once. It created a timeline, and it forced law enforcement into a welfare check that turned into a nightmare discovery. Police went to the home in Knightdale, North Carolina, for that welfare check. Inside, they found 7-month-old Bennett dead. Authorities did not publicly lock in a definitive how. In the clean, widely circulated summaries, what is confirmed is the outcome. The baby was gone, and he had been the center of this entire scandal. And there's another timeline detail that makes the story feel even colder. Reports said Bennett was last seen alive around 8 p.m. the night before, when Steven picked him up from the grandmother who had custody. That means there was a handoff, a normal-seeming moment. Here's the baby, right before everything collapsed. While authorities in North Carolina were discovering Bennett, the bigger horror was unfolding far away, because the other 2 deaths didn't happen in Knightdale. They happened in New Milford, Connecticut. That's what makes this case feel like a traveling disaster. In Connecticut, Katie Pladl and her adoptive father, Anthony Fusco, were found shot inside a pickup truck. Their bodies were discovered in the vehicle, and the scene included a shot-out window. Reporting also described them as being out running errands when it happened. An ordinary day task turned into an ambush. They were moving through normal life, shopping, driving, living, and then it was over. Police statements and reporting suggested Steven traveled there for a purpose, not randomly, to confront. And if you step back for a second, the symbolism is sickening. Anthony Fusco was the man who adopted Katie and raised her, the man who took on the job of protecting her when her biological father wasn't there. In the end, he died alongside her. The protective father figure murdered in the same moment as the daughter he raised. That is a level of betrayal that viewers don't forget. After the Connecticut killings, the case became a multi-state hunt, and the ending didn't come in a courtroom. It came in Dover, New York. Steven Pladl was found dead of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in his minivan. No trial, no cross-examination, no sentencing, no chance for the adoptive family to stare him down across a courtroom and demand answers. He removed himself from the story after leaving 3 bodies behind, including a 7-month-old baby. And that's part of why this case is so emotionally explosive. There's no courtroom closure. There's no justice landed moment where a judge reads a sentence and the public exhales. It's just damage, permanent damage. And then there's the chilling, what could have stopped this question. There were legal restrictions. There were bond conditions. There was already law enforcement involvement, but enforcement can't follow someone every second. And in this case, the moment the relationship broke, everything accelerated. Most family rampages start inside one house. Bradley William Stone turned his into a route. On the morning of December 15, 2014, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania woke up to a nightmare that unfolded in fragments. Separate emergency calls, separate addresses, separate crime scenes, and by the time investigators realized it was all connected, the damage was already catastrophic. Stone wasn't in the middle of a divorce. Nicole Hill Stone was his ex-wife. Their split had been in motion for years, and the tension that never truly died was custody. It was the kind of long-running conflict that keeps people trapped in courtrooms long after the romance ends. And in the days before the killings, that custody fight hit a new flashpoint. On December 9, 2014, just 6 days before the rampage, Stone sought emergency custody of his children. A judge denied it. That denial is the kind of detail that matters, because it gives the story a hard trigger point, a moment where the system tells someone no, and they decide the rules no longer apply to them. Before sunrise on December 15th, the first major scene was at the Pheasant Run Apartments in Lower Salford Township. Nicole Hill Stone was found dead there, but the horror didn't stay contained at that apartment complex. And this is where the case turns from dynastic tragedy into county-wide terror. Stone took his 2 young daughters from the area. That's another detail people never forget, because for a window of time, no one knew if he was going to kill them too. Police were searching for a man suspected of murder who now had his own children with him. Then came the second wave of deaths, at a different location. At a home tied to Nicole's family, multiple relatives were killed in a separate attack. This wasn't one chaotic outburst. This was a move from one scene to another, branch by branch, through a family. The victims included Nicole's mother, Joanne Hill, and her grandmother, Patricia Hill. And then the Flick family. Nicole's sister's household was hit next. Patricia Flick, Nicole's sister, was killed. Her husband, Aaron Flick, was killed. Their daughter, Nina Flick, 14 years old, was killed. A 14-year-old child. That's the moment the entire story becomes impossible to process. Because once a killer crosses into teen niece territory, the public stops searching for motives that make sense. People stop asking what happened and start asking, what kind of person does this? But there was one survivor inside that home. 17-year-old Anthony Flick. He lived. He survived with defensive injuries. Maybe tried to protect others in the middle of a massacre that turned a family home into a death scene. That's why this case locked down an entire region. The manhunt wasn't just about catching a killer. It was also about finding those little girls before it was too late. And in one of the most chilling twists of the entire rampage, the part that almost feels unreal in contrast with everything else, Stone later dropped the girls off safely. He didn't harm them. He delivered them to safety. It's the kind of detail that creates endless debate because it's such a sharp contradiction. How can someone slaughter 6 people across multiple scenes and then make a choice that looks on the surface like mercy? Some people interpret it as a last shred of control. Some see it as strategic. Some see it as a warped version of, I'm not that kind of monster, even while the bodies prove otherwise. But regardless of the reason, it meant the children lived. Then the hunt intensified. Police described Stone as armed and extremely dangerous, with military training and combat experience. They searched woods, neighborhoods, parks, and rural stretches. Residents were warned to stay inside. Schools and businesses felt the pressure. During manhunts, fear spreads faster than facts. By December 16th, 2014, the search ended in the woods near the Pennsburg and Upper Hanover area. Bradley William Stone was found dead. And here's the key correction that changes the entire tone of the ending. His death was ruled a suicide by combined drug intoxication, not a final shootout, a self-inflicted ending without courtroom consequences. just a body in the woods and a pile of grief that would never be neatly resolved. It wasn't a random mass attack. It was a targeted family wipeout tied to a custody war. But it also opened a larger, messier conversation. Stone was a Marine veteran with known mental health issues and treatment history through the VA. After the killings, there was public scrutiny of whether warning signs were missed and whether the system that treated him could have intervened differently. Context does not equal excuse. Lots of veterans struggle and never hurt anyone. Some killers run. John Hummel tried to make the crime scene tell a different story. Late on December 17th, 2009, bleeding into the early hours of December 18th, firefighters in Kennedale, Texas were called to a house fire that looked, at first glance, like a tragic accident. A quiet neighborhood, a home in flames. The kind of call first responders see too often. But once they got inside, it stopped being a fire call. It became a homicide scene. Inside the home were 3 victims. Joy Hummel, John's wife, pregnant at the time, their 5-year-old daughter Jody, and Joy's father, Clyde Bedford, often described as wheelchair-bound. 3 generations under one roof. And the first brutal truth investigators reached was this: the fire didn't kill them. The deaths happened before the flames. The blaze wasn't the tragedy, it was the cover. Joy was attacked with a knife. Jody and Clyde Bedford were beaten with a baseball bat. Then the fire was set afterward, an attempt to destroy evidence and reshape the timeline. It was a chain, violence, then staging. And when investigators turned to John Hummel, he tried to sell them a storyline. He gave police an alibi about being out all night, driving around, shopping, checking prices, and then returning home to find the house burned. The kind of explanation that's supposed to make you picture an unlucky husband stumbling into tragedy. But prosecutors later argued it was the opposite. They said he wasn't out all night by accident. He was building distance, building time gaps, building a story, because the physical evidence didn't match the version he was telling. And when fire investigators and medical examiners established that the victims were dead before the blaze, the I came home to a fire narrative collapsed. At that point, the case wasn't what happened. It was why would a man do this to his own family? The motive prosecutors painted was simple in the ugliest way: escape. A man who wanted out of his life, out of the marriage, out of responsibility, out of financial pressure, and who had another woman in the picture, a new direction he wanted to run toward. Not a clean divorce, not separation, a reset. The most chilling part of that motive is how common the feelings are and how rare the choice is. Plenty of people feel trapped. Plenty of people want to leave. Almost nobody turns their home into a staged inferno to erase the people in it. But this case wasn't just about a man killing. It was about a man trying to rewrite reality, and investigators didn't buy it. Then came another move that sealed the story. Hummel fled. Not across town, not to a buddy's house. He ran all the way to California, the Oceanside area, and he was eventually arrested there. That flight mattered because it told the jury something without words. Innocent people don't usually run that far, that fast, after their pregnant wife and child are found dead in a burned home. After he fled, he confessed. That confession, combined with the forensic timeline and the staged fire, became the backbone of the prosecution's case. He didn't return to tragedy. He created it, then tried to outdrive it. By the time the case went to trial in Tarrant County in 2011, the story the jury heard wasn't complicated. A pregnant wife, a 5-year-old child, a disabled father-in-law, killed first, fire second. The prosecution argued it was deliberate and methodical. The defense tried to steer the narrative toward mental and emotional collapse, the kind of pressure that breaks a person's grip on reality. But the state pointed to the order of operations: violence, then staging, then alibi building, then fleeing. That's the pattern of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and knew it was wrong. Hummel was convicted and sentenced to death. The case then moved through the long corridor of capital appeals, the years of litigation that come with a death sentence. And during those later years, another layer entered the public conversation. Hummel began claiming a different motive. He later suggested he believed the world was ending, an apocalyptic mindset, and implied he thought he was saving them from what was coming. That explanation became gasoline for debate. Some people saw it as evidence of serious mental illness. Others saw it as a story that surfaced later, long after the scene was staged, long after the alibi was attempted, long after the flight. That staging behavior is what makes this case so hard to reframe into anything other than conscious criminal intent. It reads like someone trying to avoid consequences, not someone acting in delusion. And in the end, the system treated it that way. On June 30th, 2021, John Hummel was executed by the state of Texas. That gives this story a type of ending many cases never get. Finality. No parole hearings. No maybe. No coming back. A husband and father choosing a knife, a bat, and a match over simply walking away. 3 sisters went on a scheduled custody visit on May 30th, 2025. They never came home. And for the next 3 months, Central Washington turned into a living nightmare. Not because of what people knew, but because of what they feared the whole time, that the danger wasn't a stranger, it was their father. On Friday, May 30th, Travis Decker picked up his daughters for a planned visitation. This wasn't an out-of-nowhere trip. It was the kind of custody handoff families do every day. The kind that's supposed to be routine enough that nobody's heart races when the car pulls away. But when the return time came and went, the girls didn't come back. At first, these situations can look like a custody violation. A parent running late, ignoring texts, refusing to cooperate. People tell themselves it's a power play, a tantrum, a petty move in a bigger custody war. Then, the hours piled up, the calls went unanswered, and late turned into missing. Law enforcement in the Wenatchee area began searching for Travis Decker and the girls. Alerts went out. His name started spreading across social media. Photos of 3 smiling sisters became the image everyone kept refreshing on their phones, hoping the next update would say they'd been found safe. But the tone shifted fast, because this wasn't just a father with kids. Authorities described Decker as someone whose life had been deteriorating. Reporting described him as living out of his truck in the period leading up to the disappearance, and officials cited worsening mental health concerns. He also had a background that made the search feel even more dangerous. He was a former soldier, an army infantryman, who had served from 2013 to 2021, including a tour in Afghanistan. That detail matters because it changes how people imagine the manhunt. This wasn't just find a guy who might be driving around town. This was find someone who might know how to disappear. As the search intensified, investigators followed the strongest lead they had, Decker's vehicle and areas tied to where he'd been staying. The hunt centered in Chelan County and the rugged terrain of central Washington, with multi-agency resources pouring in. Authorities chased tips across backcountry roads, remote campsites, and mountain areas. There were also out-of-state leads, including reports that teams followed possibilities into places like Idaho, because once someone can vanish into wilderness corridors, the map gets big fast. Then came June 2nd, 2025, 3 days after the custody visit, the kind of date that becomes a permanent scar. On June 2nd, authorities located Decker's truck near a remote campground area in Chelan County. The scene wasn't a good news discovery. It was the moment the case stopped being a missing kids search and became something far worse. Near that remote area, the bodies of Peyton, Evelyn, and Olivia were found. The reality hit like a collapse. 3 sisters who should have been heading home, eating dinner, arguing over cartoons, were gone. Autopsies later reported the girls died by suffocation, asphyxia. Those are details that don't just tell you there was violence, they tell you there was control. That is the moment the entire public mood shifts, because now it's not bring the kids home. Now it's find him. And once the girls were found on June 2nd, Travis Decker became the focus of a massive search effort. Not some vague keep an eye out, but a sustained operation in difficult terrain. Officials described him as potentially surviving off-grid. They searched mountains, forest corridors, and isolated areas where a person with survival experience might hide, rest, move, and vanish again. This is the part of the story that drives viewership through the roof. People watched daily updates. They tracked search zones like weather maps. Every tip created a surge of hope and dread at the same time. Because the worst kind of fugitive isn't the one who's loud, it's the one who's quiet, trained, and willing to sleep outdoors while the world looks for him. The search continued through the summer, and then came the final chapter, not in a courtroom, but in the mountains. On September 18th, 2025, human remains were found in the Grindstone Mountain area, near where the search had been concentrated. The discovery didn't instantly close the case, because investigators had to do what they always have to do: verify, confirm, don't guess. There was intense public attention around this moment, because people wanted the ending to be definitive. On September 25, 2025, DNA testing confirmed the remains belonged to Travis Decker. That confirmation ended the chase. But it didn't deliver the kind of ending people expect from true crime. The trial, the testimony, the sentencing, the victim's family speaking directly to a killer. Instead, it delivered a different kind of closure. The manhunt was over because the suspect was dead. And even that ending came with a grim invitation. Reporting indicated the coroner could not determine the exact cause or manner of Decker's death because only limited skeletal remains were recovered. So the final chapter wasn't a confession. It wasn't a courtroom breakdown. It was, he's dead, and we may never know exactly how. 3 sisters trusted their father enough to go with him. The system trusted him enough to allow it. And once he chose violence, the entire state learned a sick lesson. Sometimes, the most dangerous moment isn't a stranger in the dark. It's the moment you hand your kids to the person you're legally required to trust. From the father who turned a custody visit into a manhunt to the one who tried to burn his crimes away, these 10 men represent the ultimate betrayal of the paternal role. They were the protectors who became predators, the providers who chose destruction, and their actions left permanent scars on the families who trusted them most. They are, without question, among the most evil fathers who terrorized their own families. If you found this deep dive into these shocking cases compelling, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. And let me know in the comments which case disturbed you the most.